say that as a second year PhD student, I was somewhat shocked and a little bit overawed when I was asked to give this lecture this year. Basically, I was asked to give this Langford Lecture in a bit more detail about the paper that we presented at this year's conference, but also to talk a little bit more about social value in general and how it's kind of coming to the fore in construction management research. So I'm hoping through this lecture to shed a bit of light on social value and how people are currently approaching it, and then to explain in a bit more detail about what we're doing on social value in the context of Indigenous social fulfilment in Australia. So can I just get a show of hands, please? Who in the audience here is interested in a more equitable, fairer world? That's good to know. It's great. Well, unfortunately, in colonised countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and other countries internationally with minority Indigenous populations, there are large disparities and inequities in socio-economic indicators. So, in Australia, for example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians face a number of complex and policy-resistant problems, known as wicked problems, that present these large inequities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So, Indigenous Australians currently experience a lower life expectancy, a significantly lower life expectancy than non-Indigenous Australians, as well as a range of lower outcomes in terms of health, education, employment, and much higher rates of incarceration than non-Indigenous Australians. Now, back in 2007, in light of these continuing inequities and years of policy attempts to intervene and address these issues, the government commenced a new framework called Closing the Gap. And Closing the Gap in 2008 strove to halve or eliminate these inequities within a generation. And each year there's an annual report that's issued by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in Australia on the progress towards closing these gaps. Now, the 10-year milestone for this framework occurred last year, and there was a report done on the progress towards achieving these gaps, because many of the gaps, or the aims of the gap, were to close these gaps within the space of a generation or half a generation, and it was thought that by 10 years there'd be a significant amount of progress towards closing those gaps. And this report actually showed that the framework is a massive failure, and it just contributes to one in a successive series of failures in terms of trying to bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people onto the same level as non-Indigenous Australians. So this table up on the screen here, that's the most recent reporting on progress to close these gaps in the annual report. And we can see here that many of the gaps and many of the targets to close these gaps are actually not on track to be met. The green circles represent the areas where the government, or I guess the data that the government collects, is actually on track to close those gaps. And this is not just specific to Australia, it's a global problem in countries with Indigenous populations or other minority populations. So it's in this context, and in the context of emerging forms of new public governance, that there is more attention being given to the concept of social value. Now, in the research we're doing at the University of New South Wales, we adopt the somewhat broad definition that social value is the cultural, social and economic impacts of a project in the community in which it operates. And this is very broad, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But there are now a number of policies internationally aimed at creating social value for these disadvantaged communities. So in Australia, at the local, state and federal levels of government, you now have a number of Indigenous procurement policies in place. These policies set purchasing and employment targets that government departments must reach when they're purchasing goods and services, including construction works. Now, this comes under, I guess, the stream of social procurement, which aims to create social value in the communities where it's implemented. And there are also a number of international examples of social procurement or policies directly targeted at creating social value. So in the UK, we have the Public Services Social Value Act of 2012. And this is very much a flexible kind of policy that the government has implemented trying to create social value. And we had some really good discussion about this over the last few days in terms of the flexibility of the policy and how procurement managers and contractors can negotiate to determine the types of social value that they wish to create through their activities. You also have the Procurement Reform Act in Scotland, which aims to create sort of social and economic well-being in communities where government purchasing is directed. And then we also have a number of other programs such as Budding Brunels, which seeks to bring young people into the construction industry. And Gemma Bridgman over the last few years has done a couple of papers on the work of Budding Brunels and looked into the social value that it creates. You've also got, I guess, a recent book by Annie Graydon and her colleagues about social value in construction. And this kind of represents, I guess, the first sort of concrete, significant effort into theorising or understanding social value in the field of construction management research. But just going back to what I was saying about these policies and programs that are aiming to create social value. And you've got the Social Value Act in the UK. It's very flexible in that contractors and procurement managers can negotiate the types of social value or the outcomes that they're aiming to achieve. In contrast, you've got, like in Australia, examples like the Commonwealth Indigenous procurement policies that are very prescriptive in terms of the social outcomes they hope to achieve through these purchasing and employment targets that each government department must reach. And at the moment, the targets set by the Commonwealth Government are 3% of the financial value of all domestic Commonwealth expenditure must be spent on Indigenous businesses or employment. Okay, so if we take, for an example, there's a $100 spend per year for a government department, $3 of that must go to an Indigenous business or Indigenous workers. There's a kind of a problem here because on the one hand you have this very flexible kind of way of deciding what sort of social value you want to create, and on the other hand you have these prescriptive kind of approaches that dictate the types of social value that a policy wants to create. So this creates a number of challenges in measuring and understanding social value for purchasers and for buyers, for contractors as well. So there's been a number of attempts to, I guess, operationalise how social value can be measured. And by far, the most popular one at the moment is social return on investment. Now, when measuring social value, following these sort of directions provided by Nichols and his colleagues, there's a bit of a process involved. So when you're kind of researching social value, you have to understand the inputs that go into a program. Now, the inputs are the resources or the time that goes into, I guess, developing and operationalising a social procurement program. And this results in the activities that make up social procurement. So this would be purchasing from a disadvantaged cohort or from Indigenous groups such as businesses or just employees. These social procurement activities then produce a number of different results, and they each mean different things. So when you're measuring social value, you first of all consider the outputs that social procurement creates. Now these are the hard, quantifiable numbers of social procurement. So as a general example, it would be the number of disadvantaged people that your program or your procurement has employed. In the case of Australia, it's the number of contracts that have been awarded to Indigenous businesses and the financial value of those contracts. And these are collected because they're a really sort of simple way for governments and clients to collect data and information on how their social procurement is being undertaken and the types of results that it's generated. But this moves on to, I guess, the outcomes that social procurement creates. And these are, I guess, the intermediate term kind of results of social procurement. And this could be sort of the number of people who have gone on to complete, you know, a technical qualification or a trade qualification, or have gone on to complete a work program. And lastly, when measuring social value, you have to understand the social impact that a program or procurement is creating. Now these are the broader and longer term outcomes that social procurement creates. So these are the changes. So someone has been given a work or employment opportunity, and this has led to further training, which has led to more income, greater employment opportunities, and overall kind of like increased wealth, well-being, happiness, because there are a range of longer-term outcomes from increased employment, social health, mental health, physical activity, and training as well. And so in this, there are a number of sort of principles that dictate how social value measurement should be carried out. And that involves involving stakeholders in the social value process, understanding what changes, and valuing the things that matter, as an example. And SROI is just one example of how social value is measured, and there's actually still no universally agreed method or approach to measuring social value. So in light of this continued sort of lack of agreement in the field of social value, we're seeing some advances in the field being produced at ARCOM. And this year is probably the first year that we've had 2 dedicated sessions on social value. And next year I know that we've now got a track that will be the focus of next year's conference too. And it's really interesting because I was speaking about this with Martin and a couple of others yesterday and today. We're really sort of starting to form, I guess, a mini community within a community. And some of the things that have come through about social value this year, we've learned about some barriers to social procurement and how this would inhibit social value creation because of, I guess, preconceptions or policy restrictions or funding difficulties as well. We've also sort of heard a bit about the ethics and the purpose of contractors who undertake social value. Our paper, which I'll go into more detail very shortly, sort of how you include those community perspectives and experiences to understand social value and how you can engage stakeholders in the social value process. And we have the social value measurement tool by Greg Watts and colleagues. So we're really sort of making some strides in that regard. But when we submit social value to a critical analysis, there are a number of issues that still come up and continue to create challenges for us to understand and measure it. So social value is still an intangible and fuzzy concept, and it will continue to mean different things to different populations, depending on what their needs and priorities are as well. The other issue is that a lot of the sort of, I guess, philosophy driving these social procurement programs is one of economic rationalism that assumes that market forces will help solve complex social issues. So the thinking behind economic rationalism is that you get people a job, they get improved income and training, and this will help sort of solve the social problems that exist in some communities. But this sort of thinking sort of neglects the influence of social and cultural institutions in terms of how people value and place significance on labour market outcomes, and I'll go into that very shortly as well. There's also an issue that social value, and arguments are that social value equals social outcomes, but it shouldn't be confined to a simple measurement framework like an SROI process or results-based accounting. And this sort of leads into another issue that, oftentimes it is people in power who determine what social value is and how it should be measured. So this may be a client who decides what type of social value they're trying to create in their community. And oftentimes there's actually no input from the community itself. And this means that some social procurement initiatives may be well off the mark in terms of specifying a certain outcome or value that needs to be created, but actually sort of completely missing the point because it's not what the community thinks is important or is like of the utmost issue for them. And this can work to create a negative social value in communities because of these misguided sort of initiatives. What this also means is that these positions of power issues sort of starts to come up as you start going a bit deeper and expanding your research on social value, is that people who are supposed to be benefiting from social value are oftentimes also kind of excluded by these evaluations. So, going back to the SROI principles, it says to involve stakeholders, but oftentimes this uses a bit of a prescriptive framework in terms of the outcomes people are aiming for or looking for in their evaluations, as well as placing financial proxies on these certain outcomes because they need to communicate a figure back to a funder or client so they can understand, I guess, the social value they're creating in a financial sense. And then lastly, there are a number of practical and conceptual challenges in terms of understanding and operationalising social value. So conceptually, like I said, we still don't quite, there's no universally agreed definition of what social value is. And there are numerous types of value. You can have something that's of inherent value, and which that means it's valuable because it is itself. So it's an end kind of value, and it's something's value because it just is valuable. Other times you have an instrumental value, so something is valuable because it leads to something else that is valuable and good. And then these practical challenges in terms of like how you go about measuring social value, what sort of processes you use, and the financial proxies that you use as well. So if we take the Commonwealth Indigenous Procurement Policy as an example, the Australian government provided or developed some guidelines on how to evaluate Indigenous policies and programs a few years ago. And basically, these recommendations said that Indigenous evaluations need to be relevant, robust, credible, and appropriate. And these best practice principles then inform activity streams, that evaluations need to be based on collaboration, capability, and Indigenous knowledges and experiences. And this is a bit of a cyclical process as a way to really kind of involve Indigenous people in the evaluation process so the government gets direct feedback on the sorts of impact that their policies are having. But when you look at how Indigenous procurement policies are actually evaluated, the evaluations focus on three main areas. They focus on the outputs, and these are the number of contracts that have been awarded and the financial value of those contracts. They also focus on how these policies have actually been implemented by procurement managers and the sorts of processes they go through to purchase from Indigenous businesses. And then lastly, they also focus on the expenditure that's been spent on Indigenous businesses as part of these policies. So if anyone saw my presentation on Monday, you'd see that since its introduction in 2015, the Commonwealth Indigenous Procurement Policy has been largely successful. And it's successful because its reporting mechanisms focus on these two areas of the outputs and the expenditure, so the number of contracts that have been awarded and the total financial value of those contracts. So in our research, we're trying to learn about social value from the perspective of businesses and workers who've taken part or worked under these policies, because that's currently excluded from these evaluations. So we needed to go back and theorise social value and try and understand how it might be created. And I guess philosophical discussions of value, they go back to classical philosophers, but these these still kind of remain somewhat broad or mainly consist of arguments that something is of value because it is good or because it is morally right. And for us, that wasn't enough sort of insight into how social value would be created. So we found this framework from the late 19th century by a philosopher called Alexius Meinl, and it's basically a theory of value, but we've embedded it with social aspects and our work on strain theory to come up with this process of social value. So on this framework, on this diagram, you'll see that it's bounded by a circle, and this is what's known as the value subject. So this represents the people who benefit from and experience the social value. So these are people who are directly affected by a social procurement program. And there's a bit of a process that goes on here. So in this framework as well, the value feeling that's at the top of our triangle, that creates the social value, and that comes from people's interactions with the object of social procurement, or the social procurement opportunity, and an existence judgment, which is based on their cultural goals and values, and that will determine how they see a value in social procurement outcomes. So in our research, in an Indigenous context, we're exploring the relationship between the value object being Indigenous social procurement and people's cultural goals and values. So basically we think when there's an alignment between Indigenous social procurement opportunities and Indigenous cultural goals and values, people will see more benefit in Indigenous social procurement and therefore will see more social value. So this kind of simple diagram just sort of tries to illustrate the influence that these cultural goals and values have on how people determine social value outcomes. So basically we draw on some work of Siobhan Austin, who talks about the role of old institutionalism, which is the role of those cultural and social institutions, and how culture, being, I guess, the languages, norms, customs, morals, values, beliefs, and conventions that are shared by a particular group, how they significantly influence the value that people place on labour market outcomes. So in this sense, we think of social value being an outcome of labour market activity because people have participated in the workforce under an Indigenous procurement policy, and the value that they place on that outcome will be significantly influenced by their cultural goals and values. So that's I've just kind of done this up to sort of represent how culture will influence our understanding of how social value is created. And we know that Indigenous society and non-Indigenous society in Australia are vastly different cultures. And there's been some research done about how these two societies have different value systems and how they view the world. So Indigenous culture traditionally is very much subsistence-based, and it's based on the approach that a community or society only takes what is needed for today, and it leaves surplus there, whereas non-Indigenous society is based on a capitalist economy that accumulates wealth. And furthermore, this sort of translates into how the two societies, Indigenous and non-Indigenous societies in Australia, are kind of organised. So non-Indigenous or Western society in Australia, based on its European or Eurocentric systems, is very much an individualist society. It places an emphasis on the rights of the individual, whereas in contrast, Indigenous society is very much collectivist and egalitarian. And there is very much a concern for the community at large, rather than just focusing on sort of individual advancement, and making sure you look after yourself and not so much other people as well. And so these different values have actually been captured in some research in Darwin. And I've just put up some quotes here that were found in this research. And basically these quotes kind of illustrate how Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory feel like they have to live in two worlds. Now, the two worlds metaphor refers to the fact that on the one hand, Aboriginal people feel like they have to kind of like conform to European mainstream Australian society, but they also feel that they are obligated to maintain traditional Aboriginal values and customs. And so this creates a bit of an internal struggle within people in terms of, on the one hand, they feel like they have to sort of integrate into the mainstream or non-Indigenous society, but on the other hand, they get criticised by their own community for giving up their Aboriginality and becoming, in essence, a white sellout. So this creates a lot of internal turmoil within Indigenous people. So for us to understand how social value is kind of created, we've done some work on cultural counterfactuals. And basically our work on cultural counterfactuals from last year's ARCOM conference believes that positive social value is the result of what we call a work-culture balance. So not a work-life balance, a work-culture balance. And this means that positive social value will be created because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers will be able to sort of experience like positive work benefits, such as a meaningful job, because a lot of Indigenous people are only provided with tokenistic labouring or cleaning jobs, and they see no real value in that because they feel they're only there to make up the numbers, and there's nothing worth in that kind of employment opportunity. On the other hand, we feel that if a work or an employer is considerate of or aware of and responsive to Indigenous culture, that will allow people to maintain and fulfil, their values, and that will also result in positive social value. And this is not something, that we've sort of made just for Indigenous research. It's, in essence, it's kind of based on the understanding that people want to work for employers who provide them with benefits, with good work benefits, as well as being able to express their personal values and attitudes as well. So it's very much almost like heading down an employer of choice kind of avenue, because people will want to work for employers who help them realise both of these benefits. So I just want to talk about some examples of how this Indigenous social value is being explored in Australia. And I also work on another Australian Research Council funded project on social procurement in construction. Multiplex's connectivity centres are an initiative they created a few years ago, aiming to help disadvantaged cohorts find work in the construction industry. So they'll provide training programs and outfits for migrants, long-term unemployed youth, and Indigenous people. And then once they go through a training program, they'll place them with a job and try and follow up that job so it's a sustainable employment opportunity, and that person remains in that job and doesn't continue to transition in and out. And so we're doing some great work back home at the moment on how this is being implemented to address long-term unemployment in Sydney. In terms of our research, recognising the argument that marginalised populations are often excluded from social value research, we've adopted what's called decolonised research. Now, and this was the focus of this year's paper on a yarning discussion group. Now, decolonised research simply refers to research that centres and prioritises the perspectives, experiences and knowledges of historically marginalised and oppressed people. And our paper this year sort of talked about how we can decolonise social value research through a culturally appropriate focus group, what we call a yarning discussion group. So basically what this involves is we've taken a traditional focus group discussion and understanding that research is a harmful term for some Indigenous people, we've subverted, I guess, those traditional European-derived themes and concepts within the focus group discussion to make it more culturally appropriate for our Indigenous participant stakeholders as a way to get the rich data that we need for our research to develop indicators of social value. And if you'd like to read more about it, I do recommend that you read our paper, not just because it's our paper. So, one way you can go about decolonising social value research and just social value research in general is through what's called community-based participatory research. Now, community-based participatory research, again, it's a way of including historically marginalised people in the research processes so that researchers understand and respond to their concerns and priorities about research outcomes. So in our research, for this year's ARCOM paper, we've been working with the New South Wales Indigenous Chamber of Commerce as a community stakeholder, probably since before I was actually enrolled in my PhD. And we've really, over the process of the last 18 months to 2 years, I've been undertaking a process of collaborative yarning. Now, collaborative yarning is up on the screen here, because yarning is a culturally appropriate form of sharing and gathering knowledge in Indigenous society back home. And collaborative yarning really means sharing ideas and swapping concepts to see that you really reach a bit of a shared understanding and mutual agreement of a researcher's aims and objectives and how it's going to be carried out. And so this has been argued to be a really sort of empowering process for these communities who are historically kind of like excluded from research processes. So that's what we're currently doing. We're building relationships with community stakeholders. We're trying to understand perspectives of social value and how it could and should be measured, and then use that in a way that benefits Indigenous communities. So our research plan at the moment, just a bit of background, I'm not an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander Australian. I grew up on the traditional lands of the Bidjigal people in southeast Sydney. And growing up on the lands of the Bidjigal people, many of my friends growing up are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. And so for me, that kind of illustrates that I'm no expert in Indigenous culture, and I need to work with Indigenous stakeholders in ways that are productive and ways that produce meaningful and relevant outcomes for the community. So we're working with communities and organisations to understand and build from the ground up some indicators of social value using culturally sensitive methods. So ways that promote knowledge gathering and production in Indigenous societies. We'll then use these to develop some indicators of social value, and following on with the principles of community-based research, hope to get an understanding of the social value that Indigenous procurement policies actually create. And the outcome of this research, as well as reporting on social value, we intend to develop a social value measurement tool that we can provide to Indigenous businesses so that they can demonstrate the social value their organisation creates and increase their competitiveness in future contenders to make them more competitive. But sorry, I'm almost done. So just researching in this space is a bit of a complex sort of area. It can be very political, and it can be sort of difficult to access organisations and people. So there's really a lengthy process of building relationships and the sustainable relationships that you need to create a meaningful sort of environment to really kind of develop these culturally centred methods. So there are all other sorts of issues in terms of getting access to communities and organisations so that you can actually sit down and have a yarn about your research. Because oftentimes you treat it with a bit of caution. And so this kind of then leads into, once you do get in, about sort of researching within or in alignment with Indigenous values and principles. So respect and reciprocity are two main ones that we have to consider moving forward. And it's important to us, and this involves like a constant process of negotiation and ensuring that both parties are on the same page. Over the last few months, we've had to go back, and really work on expanding our relationship network. And we've had to approach we've had to rethink our methodological approach while we're sort of building those new relationships. And through these new relationships, at the moment we're sort of working with 2 other medium-sized contractors in New South Wales. And through those relationships, these new stakeholders actually recommended to us because they have multi-site. I'm almost done. They have multi-site projects. So in terms of them, it was actually their preference for us to try and issue, or to develop and issue a survey that they could provide to their workers, and a survey that would then sort of could be explored in more detail through case study research. And we're aware that that sort of approach is somewhat contradictory to the principles of decolonised research that we write about in this year's paper. But we take comfort in the fact that it was through the relationships that we have with our stakeholders that we were actually able to arise at that new approach. And so we do continue to build on those relationships with the community. Alright, so some implications and some next steps of this research. So this research, we feel, will shed more light on the topic of cultural counterfactuals, and it will shed more light on the things that create negative social harm for Indigenous communities and workers when governments implement these social procurement programs to try and address the inequity gaps that currently exist. So this will create a community-centred view of social value that's grounded in people's lived experiences. But next steps for us are maintaining our flexibility in research processes. So like I was saying, the process that we've gone through over the last few months in terms of having to rethink and rebuild our relationship network really required a lot of flexibility on our part. We had to sort of be flexible and work with community and organisations to find new ways forward, to find solutions to the problems we were encountering. So this obviously requires regular negotiation in terms of what's expected of research in communities when you're trying to understand social value. So understanding what's important to them, what's important to you, and how you can sort of combine those to come to like a common agreement that will create sustainable outcomes. And then obviously we're going to continue building on our research relationships, because like I said, the product of our research, we hope to be a social value tool we can provide to Indigenous businesses, and in that way we hope to have like a long-standing and sustainable relationship with our stakeholders. Alright, thanks for listening everyone. Cheers.